You've been told to chase happiness, but not how to build peace. You've been taught to win, not how to endure. Today, that changes. This is not motivation. It's not self-help. It's a return to the wisdom that shaped emperors, warriors, and philosophers. In the next 2 hours, you'll rediscover what it means to live, not through comfort, but through clarity. We will burn away illusion. We will confront pain. And in that fire, you will rebuild yourself. This is the Stoic path. Not as an idea, but as a way to fix your life from the inside out. You wake to the sound of notifications, a relentless digital heartbeat that begins before your actual heart has found its rhythm. Before you've drawn your first conscious breath, the world is already demanding your attention. Emails from yesterday's unfinished business, news alerts painting catastrophe in 16 different shades, social media notifications promising connection but delivering only comparison. This is the symphony of modern life, a crescendo of other people's urgencies masquerading as your own. You scroll through lives curated to perfection, each post a carefully edited performance of happiness, success, achievement. The algorithm feeds you exactly what will keep you engaged, which is to say, exactly what will keep you unsatisfied, more content, more opinions, more reasons to feel like you're falling behind in a race you never signed up for. By 8 a.m., you've already consumed more information than most humans throughout history encountered in a lifetime. Your nervous system, evolved for the quiet rhythms of sunrise and seasonal change, now operates on the frantic tempo of fiber optic cables and satellite signals. You check your phone 150 times today, not because you're expecting anything specific, but because the silence between notifications has become unbearable. The quiet moments, once sacred spaces for reflection, now feel like empty containers that must be filled with digital noise. This is not living. This is surviving at the speed of light. 2,300 years ago, a man named Epictetus understood something we've forgotten. Born into slavery, physically disabled, with no control over his circumstances, he discovered a truth that would echo through centuries. We suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgment of them. Epictetus lived in chains, yet he was freer than most people today. How? Because he understood the difference between what was within his control and what was not. And in that understanding, he found unshakable peace. But you, surrounded by abundance, connected to infinite possibilities, armed with technologies that would seem like magic to ancient minds, you feel trapped, overwhelmed, constantly reactive to forces you cannot control. The irony is suffocating. We have more freedom than any generation in human history, yet we experience less peace. We have more ways to connect, yet we feel more isolated. We have access to all human knowledge, yet we're drowning in information while starving for wisdom. Every morning you wake up and immediately surrender your peace to the chaos of external circumstances. Traffic delays dictate your mood. Other people's opinions shape your self-worth. News cycles determine your worldview. Market fluctuations affect your sense of security. You've become a puppet dancing to strings you cannot see, controlled by forces you never chose to empower. Consider this moment, right now, as you absorb these words. How many other inputs are competing for your attention? How many tabs are open in your browser? How many times have you already checked your phone while reading this? How many thoughts about tomorrow's responsibilities or yesterday's regrets are pulling your mind away from this present moment? This is the modern condition. perpetual distraction from the one thing that actually belongs to you, this moment, this breath, this choice of where to direct your attention. The Stoics called this fundamental misunderstanding the source of all human suffering. We've confused the vast world of external circumstances, over which we have little to no control, with the small but sovereign domain of our own responses, over which we have complete authority. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, ruler of the known world, wrote in his private journal, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The man who could command legions understood that true power wasn't found in controlling others, but in mastering himself. But you wake up each day trying to control the weather, other people's behaviors, market forces, traffic patterns, global politics, and social media algorithms. You exhaust yourself fighting battles that cannot be won, trying to manage variables that exist entirely outside your influence. Meanwhile, the one domain where you have absolute sovereignty, your own thoughts, responses, and choices, remains largely unexamined and undisciplined. This is why meditation retreats exist. This is why people escape to cabins in the mountains. This is why silence, when we finally encounter it, feels simultaneously terrifying and sacred. Because in the quiet spaces between the noise, something ancient awakens, something that remembers what peace actually feels like. But you don't need to escape to find this peace. You don't need to retreat from the world or abandon your responsibilities. You need to reclaim your authority over the only territory that was ever truly yours, your inner landscape. The noise of modern life isn't the problem. The problem is that you've forgotten how to find the silence within the noise. You've lost touch with the still center that exists regardless of external circumstances. Who are you when the notifications stop? Who are you when the social media validates nothing? Who are you when the achievements fade and the acquisitions break and the relationships end? Who are you when silence finally finds you? This question terrifies most people because they've never met themselves without distraction. They've never encountered their own thoughts without the comfort of external validation. They've built their identity entirely on shifting foundations: other people's opinions, societal expectations, material circumstances that change with every economic wind. But the Stoics understood that beneath all the noise, beneath all the chaos, beneath all the circumstances you cannot control, there exists an unshakable core, a place of profound peace and genuine strength, a sanctuary that no external force can touch. The journey to this place begins with a simple recognition. You've been fighting the wrong battles. You've been trying to control the uncontrollable while neglecting the only thing that actually responds to your will, your own mind. This recognition doesn't require dramatic changes to your external life. It requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your internal experience. It requires learning to distinguish between what belongs to you and what belongs to the world. And in that distinction, clear, simple, uncompromising, lies the beginning of genuine freedom. The coffee shop conversation happens every day, in every city, in 1,000 different variations. Someone's complaining about their boss, their partner, the economy, the weather, the government. The litany of grievances flows like water, each complaint a small surrender of personal power to external circumstances. If only my boss would recognize my work. If only the economy would improve. If only people would be more reasonable. If only the world would cooperate with my plans. Listen closely to these conversations, perhaps even your own internal monologue, and you'll hear something profound: the assumption that happiness, peace and fulfillment depend on rearranging the external world to match internal preferences. This assumption is so fundamental to modern thinking that we rarely question it. Of course, our mood depends on whether people treat us well. Of course, our sense of security depends on economic stability. Of course, our peace of mind depends on things going according to plan. But what if this entire framework is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of where power actually resides? The Stoics identified this misunderstanding as the root of all psychological suffering. They called it the confusion between what is up to us and what is not up to us. And they spent lifetimes developing practices to make this distinction so clear, so automatic, that no external circumstance could disturb their fundamental equilibrium. Epictetus, who knew something about powerlessness, taught his students to begin each day by reviewing this distinction. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, position, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. Read that again. Notice what's included in each category. Your health? Not entirely up to you. Genetics, accidents, and aging operate by their own laws. Your reputation? Not up to you. Other people form opinions based on their own perspectives, biases, and incomplete information. Your financial situation? Partially up to you through your choices, but subject to market forces, economic cycles, and countless variables beyond your influence. Your relationships? You can influence them through your behavior, but you cannot control how others choose to respond. This might seem discouraging at first. Where's the motivation to try if so much lies outside our control? But look at what remains in your domain. Your opinions about what happens to you, your motivation in the face of circumstances, your desires and what you choose to pursue, your aversions and what you choose to avoid, your responses to whatever life presents. This territory might seem smaller than what you thought you controlled, but it is infinitely more powerful, because this territory is completely, unquestionably, unconditionally yours. Consider the difference between a person who wakes up determined to control other people's behavior and a person who wakes up committed to responding wisely to whatever others choose to do. The first person will spend their day frustrated, reactive, and exhausted. The second person maintains their center regardless of external chaos. This isn't passive resignation. This is the difference between pushing against an immovable wall and learning to dance with forces larger than yourself. Modern psychology has validated this ancient wisdom through decades of research on what psychologists call locus of control. People with an internal locus of control, those who believe their actions significantly influence their life outcomes, consistently show higher levels of well-being, resilience, and achievement. They experience less anxiety, less depression, and greater life satisfaction. But the Stoics went deeper than modern psychology. They weren't just interested in feeling better, they were pursuing something they called ataraxia, unshakable tranquility that persists regardless of external circumstances. They understood that even within the sphere of our influence, there are levels of control. You can control your effort, but not always the outcome. You can control your preparation, but not whether the opportunity arises. You can control your honesty, but not whether others believe you. This leads to what might be the most liberating realization in all of philosophy. Your fundamental well-being never depends on getting what you want from the world. It depends only on how you choose to relate to what the world gives you. Think about the last time you were truly upset. Trace the emotion back to its source. Likely, you'll find an expectation that reality should be different than it is. Someone should have behaved differently. An outcome should have gone another way. The weather should have cooperated. Traffic should have moved faster. But reality is under no obligation to meet your preferences. The universe operates according to its own laws, most of which remain invisible to you. Your expectations are important for planning and goal setting, but when they become demands that reality must fulfill for you to be okay, they become sources of perpetual frustration. The Stoic alternative is radical in its simplicity. Align your will with what actually happens, rather than demanding that what happens align with your will. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means investing your energy where it can actually make a difference, in your responses, your choices, your growth, your character. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself during military campaigns along the Danube frontier, captured this beautifully. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate associates you. Notice the word love. This isn't grim acceptance. This is finding a way to embrace whatever life presents as raw material for becoming who you're meant to be. When you truly understand what is and isn't under your control, something extraordinary happens. You stop wasting energy on futile battles. You stop taking things personally that were never about you. You stop feeling like a victim of circumstances and start feeling like an artist with whatever materials life provides. The weather stops determining your mood. Other people's opinions stop dictating your self-worth. Economic fluctuations stop defining your sense of security. Political developments stop controlling your peace of mind. Not because you become indifferent to these things, but because you've located your center in something that no external force can touch, your capacity to choose your response to whatever arises. This is not a theoretical insight. This is a practical skill that can be developed through daily practice. Every challenging situation becomes an opportunity to distinguish between what's yours and what's not. Every frustration becomes a chance to redirect energy from futile resistance to wise response. The illusion of control dissolves not into helplessness, but into a deeper understanding of where your true power lies. And in that understanding, you discover something the external world can never give you and can never take away: genuine freedom. We live our lives as if we have guarantees, as if the job will last, the health will hold, the relationships will endure, as if tomorrow will arrive on schedule and the people we love will be there to greet it. We make plans spanning decades based on the assumption that the future will unfold in predictable patterns, that disruption is the exception rather than the rule. But life, with its characteristic sense of humor, regularly reminds us that certainty is perhaps the grandest illusion of all. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the ancient world, wrote these words in his private journal: "You could leave life right now." Let this determine your actions, speech, and thought. He wasn't being morbid. He was being honest about the fundamental condition of human existence. We are temporary beings in a temporary world, creating temporary structures and calling them permanent. This recognition that impermanence is the only permanent feature of existence strikes most people as deeply disturbing. We've built entire industries around avoiding this truth. Insurance policies, retirement plans, security systems, medical interventions, all designed to create the feeling of control over an fundamentally uncertain future. But what if the death of certainty isn't something to be feared, but something to be embraced? The Stoics discovered something remarkable. When you fully accept the impermanent nature of all things, you stop taking them for granted. When you truly understand that every experience might be your last of its kind, ordinary moments become precious. When you realize that nothing lasts forever, you learn to be fully present for what exists right now. This isn't philosophy. This is practical wisdom born from honest confrontation with reality. Consider the last time you moved houses. Remember the strange experience of walking through familiar rooms for the final time. Suddenly, spaces you'd barely noticed became meaningful. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table, the view from the bedroom window, the sound of neighbors you'd grown accustomed to ignoring. Moving forces a temporary awareness of impermanence. But that awareness usually fades once we settle into new patterns, new illusions of permanence. The Stoics practiced something they called memento mori. Remember death. Not as a macabre fixation, but as a daily reminder that this moment, this breath, this conversation might be among your last. Not to create anxiety, but to create appreciation. When you truly understand that your time with someone is limited, you stop postponing important conversations. When you realize that your capacity for experience is finite, you stop sleepwalking through your days. When you accept that everything you love will eventually be lost, you learn to love more fully while you can. This perspective transforms everything. The difficult colleague becomes someone fighting their own battles with limited time to figure things out. The traffic jam becomes a few extra minutes to exist without demands. The ordinary Tuesday evening becomes a unique configuration of light, weather, and consciousness that will never exist in exactly this way again. Uncertainty, rather than being an obstacle to happiness, becomes the source of life's preciousness. But our culture teaches the opposite. We're encouraged to pursue security, stability, predictability. We're told that happiness comes from controlling outcomes, from building reliable structures, from minimizing risk. Yet the most secure, stable, predictable existence is the existence of a rock. No uncertainty, no change, no growth, and no consciousness to appreciate anything. The uncertainty that makes us anxious is the same uncertainty that makes love possible. If you knew with absolute certainty how someone would respond to you, there would be no risk in approaching them, and therefore no courage required, no vulnerability offered, no genuine connection possible. The uncertainty that makes planning difficult is the same uncertainty that makes hope meaningful. If the future were predetermined, your choices wouldn't matter, and therefore growth, change, and transformation would be impossible. The uncertainty that makes loss painful is the same uncertainty that makes every moment a gift rather than an entitlement. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre called this condition radical freedom. Because nothing is predetermined, because certainty is an illusion, you are constantly creating yourself through your choices. Every moment offers infinite possibilities for who you might become. This freedom can feel overwhelming, what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom. Without fixed rails to guide you, you must choose your direction moment by moment. Without guarantees about outcomes, you must act on incomplete information. Without certainty about others' responses, you must risk vulnerability and potential rejection. But this is precisely what makes you human, rather than a machine following programming. The Stoics approached this uncertainty with a kind of cosmic humor. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Today I escaped anxiety." Or no, I discarded it because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. He understood that anxiety about uncertainty is optional. The uncertainty itself is not. Wishing things were different is like being angry at gravity for making things fall down. But accepting uncertainty doesn't mean becoming passive or careless. It means making decisions and taking action while holding outcomes lightly. It means doing your best with available information while staying open to new data. It means planning for the future while remaining present to what actually exists right now. There's a profound relief in abandoning the exhausting project of trying to control the uncontrollable. When you stop demanding guarantees from a universe that offers none, you can focus on what actually matters, how you choose to respond to whatever arises. Some of life's most beautiful experiences become possible only when we surrender the need for certainty. Love requires risking heartbreak. Creativity requires risking failure. Growth requires risking the comfort of what you already know. The alternative, attempting to eliminate all uncertainty, leads not to security but to a gradual shrinking of life. Fear of loss prevents you from fully engaging with what you have. Fear of failure prevents you from attempting what matters. Fear of change prevents you from growing into who you might become. The death of certainty is not the death of hope. It's the birth of authentic engagement with life as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. Every morning, you wake up in a universe that doesn't owe you anything, not safety, not fairness, not permanence. But that same universe offers you something far more valuable, the opportunity to choose how you'll spend this day, knowing it's the only one like it you'll ever have. This knowledge doesn't make life easier, it makes life more real, and in that reality, uncertain, impermanent, and absolutely unique, you discover a depth of experience that no amount of artificial security could provide. The question isn't whether you can learn to live with uncertainty. The question is whether you can learn to live fully because of it. The ancient Greek temple at Delphi bore an inscription that would echo through millennia. Know thyself. Simple words that contain perhaps the most difficult challenge in human existence. For most of us live our entire lives without ever truly meeting ourselves, without ever seeing clearly the patterns of thought, the hidden motivations, the unconscious stories that shape our daily experience. We mistake our thoughts for truth, our emotions for reality, our reactions for inevitable responses to external circumstances. We live on the surface of our own consciousness, rarely diving beneath the chatter to explore the deeper currents that actually determine the direction of our lives. But the Stoics understood something that modern psychology has only recently validated. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that observes your thoughts. And in that distinction lies the possibility of genuine freedom. Consider this moment. Right now, as you read these words, thoughts are arising in your mind, perhaps analytical thoughts about the ideas being presented, perhaps practical thoughts about things you need to do later, perhaps judgmental thoughts about whether this is worth your time. But notice, who is aware of these thoughts? If you are your thoughts, who is it that can observe them arising and passing away? If your thoughts define you, how can you choose which ones to follow and which ones to ignore? There's something in you that exists prior to thought, deeper than emotion, more fundamental than the stories you tell yourself about who you are. The Stoics called this your prohairesis, your capacity for choice, your faculty of judgment, your essential self that remains constant while everything else changes. This essential self is what Marcus Aurelius addressed when he wrote his private reflections. Not the emperor, not the philosopher, not the man with specific roles and responsibilities, but the conscious awareness that could observe and direct all these identities. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But realizing this requires what modern psychology calls metacognition. Thinking about thinking, becoming aware of awareness itself. It requires developing the ability to step back from your immediate experience and observe it with some degree of objectivity. This isn't easy. Most of the time, you're so identified with your thoughts and emotions that you can't see them clearly. You're like someone who's never seen their own face because they've never looked in a mirror. The Stoics developed practices specifically designed to create this mirror of self-awareness. They engaged in daily self-examination, reviewing their thoughts, emotions, and reactions with the same attention a scientist might apply to interesting data. Seneca wrote in his letters, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." Each day offered an opportunity to observe patterns, to notice what triggered reactive responses, to identify the gaps between intention and action. But this self-examination wasn't a form of self-criticism or judgment. It was investigation, curious, patient, thorough. Like a researcher studying a fascinating subject that happened to be their own consciousness. When you begin to observe your thoughts rather than being captured by them, remarkable things start to happen. You notice that most of your mental activity is repetitive, the same worries cycling through your mind, the same judgments arising in response to familiar triggers, the same stories replaying with minor variations. You start to see how your emotions, which seem so overwhelming when you're caught in them, actually follow predictable patterns. Anger arising from unmet expectations, fear emerging from imagined future scenarios, sadness connected to attachments to things that have changed or ended. You begin to recognize that many of your strongest reactions have less to do with present circumstances than with historical patterns formed in earlier experiences. You're not just responding to what's happening now. You're responding to what happened before in similar situations. This recognition doesn't eliminate emotional responses, but it changes your relationship with them. Instead of being overwhelmed by emotions, you can observe them with interest. Instead of being controlled by thoughts, you can examine them for accuracy and usefulness. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy has validated this ancient Stoic practice. When you can identify and examine your automatic thoughts, you can begin to question them. Is this thought accurate? Is it helpful? Is it based on current reality or historical patterns? What would be a more balanced perspective? But the Stoics went even deeper than changing thoughts. They recognized that beneath all thoughts and emotions lies a fundamental choice about how to relate to whatever arises in consciousness. You can relate to difficult emotions as enemies to be defeated, or as information to be understood. You can relate to challenging thoughts as problems to be solved, or as mental events to be observed without necessarily believing or acting on them. You can relate to external circumstances as tests of your character, or as random events that have no inherent meaning beyond what you choose to give them. This capacity for choice about how to relate to your experience is the deepest level of freedom available to human beings. No external force can touch it. No circumstance can compromise it. No other person can take it away. But accessing this freedom requires practice. It requires developing what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to remain present and engaged with experience while holding your thoughts and emotions lightly. The Stoics practiced this through daily reflection, usually in the evening. Not dwelling on mistakes or achievements, but observing the day's experiences as data about how consciousness operates under various conditions. What situations triggered reactive responses? What thoughts arose automatically in challenging moments? What emotions emerged, and how did they influence behavior? What choices were made consciously versus unconsciously? This isn't about becoming perfectly rational or eliminating all emotional responses. Emotions provide valuable information about what matters to you. Thoughts, even automatic ones, sometimes offer useful insights. But when you can observe these internal phenomena rather than being completely identified with them, you gain access to a space of choice that exists between stimulus and response. In that space, you can choose how to proceed based on your values and goals rather than being driven by automatic patterns. This is what the Stoics meant by knowing yourself. Not just understanding your personality traits or psychological patterns, but recognizing the essential awareness that observes all these phenomena. Not just identifying your strengths and weaknesses, but contacting the fundamental capacity for choice that exists prior to any particular strength or weakness. In this recognition, you discover that you are far more resilient, far more capable, and far more free than you previously imagined. The mirror of the self reveals not just who you have been, but who you might become when you stop limiting yourself to historical patterns and start expressing your essential capacity for conscious choice. There comes a moment, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, when everything shifts. Not in the external world, which continues its chaotic dance of circumstances beyond your control, but in the invisible space between you and your experience of the world. It might happen while sitting in traffic that would normally trigger frustration. Instead of the familiar cascade of irritation, resistance, and internal complaint, there's a pause, a space, a recognition that this moment is exactly what it is, and your peace doesn't depend on it being different. Or it might emerge during a conversation that would typically leave you defensive or reactive. Instead of the automatic urge to protect your position or prove your point, there's a curious stillness, a capacity to listen without the need to immediately respond, to be present with someone else's perspective without losing your own center. This is the spark of awareness that the Stoics spent lifetimes cultivating. Not a one-time enlightenment experience, but a gradual strengthening of the muscle of consciousness that can observe itself. Marcus Aurelius described this shift in his private journal. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. Notice that he didn't say happiness depends on changing your circumstances, controlling other people's behavior, or achieving particular outcomes. He placed it entirely within your way of thinking, not the content of your thoughts, but your relationship with the process of thinking itself. This awareness doesn't arise through effort so much as through a kind of gentle vigilance, like learning to notice when you're holding your breath and remembering to breathe naturally. Like becoming conscious of muscle tension you weren't aware you were carrying and allowing it to release. Most of the time, you're so absorbed in the content of experience, what's happening, what you think about what's happening, how you feel about what you think about what's happening, that you lose contact with the awareness within which all this activity is occurring. But awareness itself is always present. It's the constant background against which all thoughts, emotions, and sensations appear. It's the space within which your entire life unfolds. And unlike the contents of consciousness, which are constantly changing, awareness itself remains stable and unaffected by whatever appears within it. When you begin to recognize this awareness as your true nature, not the temporary thoughts and emotions and circumstances, but the conscious space within which they all arise, something profound relaxes. You stop taking your thoughts so personally. They're just mental events arising in consciousness, no more inherently meaningful than clouds passing through the sky. Some thoughts are useful, some are not. Some are accurate, some are not. Some deserve action, some deserve to be noticed and released. You stop being overwhelmed by emotions. They're information about how you're relating to circumstances, but they're not commands that must be obeyed. Fear might arise, but you don't have to be controlled by it. Anger might emerge, but you don't have to be driven by it. Joy might appear, but you don't have to cling to it desperately. You stop needing external circumstances to cooperate with your preferences for you to be fundamentally okay. Your essential well-being becomes independent of whether things go according to plan, whether people behave as you wish, whether outcomes match your expectations. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or passive. If anything, it allows for more skillful engagement with life, because you're no longer operating from a defensive crouch, constantly protecting your ego from perceived threats. When you're not worried about looking good, you can focus on doing good. When you're not concerned with being right, you can concentrate on being helpful. When you're not afraid of discomfort, you can take risks that serve something larger than your immediate preferences. The Stoics called this state ataraxia, unshakable tranquility that persists regardless of external conditions. But it's not the tranquility of someone who has withdrawn from life. It's the tranquility of someone who has learned to engage with life from a place of inner stability. Imagine being in the eye of a hurricane. Around you, everything is movement and noise and apparent chaos. But where you are, there's perfect stillness. You can see clearly in all directions. You can respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. You can help others find their way to this same center of calm. This is what becomes possible when you learn to identify with awareness itself rather than with the temporary contents of consciousness. But this recognition requires what the Stoics called prosoche, continuous attention to the present moment, not forcing anything to change, but simply remaining awake to what's actually happening rather than getting lost in stories about what's happening. When you notice your mind creating elaborate narratives about past events that can't be changed, you can gently return attention to what exists right now. When you find yourself anxiously projecting into imaginary future scenarios, you can come back to the only moment that actually exists. When you catch yourself taking your thoughts about a situation more seriously than the situation itself, you can reconnect with direct experience rather than interpretation of experience. This practice of returning attention to present moment awareness is both extraordinarily simple and surprisingly challenging. Simple because it requires nothing more than noticing where your attention has gone and gently bringing it back. Challenging because the mind has been conditioned to constantly wander into past regrets and future worries. But every time you make this return, every time you choose presence over mental time travel, you strengthen your capacity to remain centered regardless of circumstances. And in this growing capacity, you begin to taste a freedom that doesn't depend on external conditions, a peace that doesn't require life to be peaceful, a strength that doesn't need to prove itself through controlling others. You start to understand viscerally what Epictetus meant when he said, "No one can hurt you without your permission." Not because harmful things won't happen, they will. Not because people won't behave badly, they might. Not because life won't present challenges, it certainly will. But because you've located your essential self in something that remains untouchable regardless of what appears in the temporary theater of circumstances. This spark of awareness, once recognized, never completely disappears. It might be forgotten temporarily when you get caught up in drama or urgency or the seductive certainty of your opinions. But it's always available to be remembered. And each time you remember, each time you step back into this aware presence that you actually are, the path back becomes more familiar. What seemed impossible begins to feel natural. What felt foreign begins to feel like coming home. The journey toward genuine freedom has begun. There's a moment in every transformative journey when inspiration must yield to discipline, when understanding must become practice, when philosophy must meet the raw resistance of daily reality. This is where most people turn back. This is where good intentions meet the grinding work of actual change. The Stoics understood this critical juncture. They knew that wisdom without practice is merely entertainment, that insight without application is just sophisticated procrastination. They built their philosophy not on beautiful ideas, but on 4 concrete pillars that could support a human life under any conditions: courage, justice, temperance, wisdom. These weren't abstract virtues to be admired from a distance, but practical capacities to be developed through deliberate training. Like muscles that grow stronger under resistance, these qualities emerge not through comfort, but through the disciplined embrace of difficulty. Consider courage, not the Hollywood version that involves dramatic gestures and spectacular risks, but the quiet daily courage required to live with integrity. The courage to have difficult conversations instead of avoiding them. The courage to admit when you're wrong instead of defending a position you know is false. The courage to face uncertainty without the numbing comfort of false certainties. Modern psychology calls this psychological resilience. The capacity to maintain functionality and even grow stronger through adversity. Researchers have identified specific factors that contribute to resilience: cognitive flexibility, social support, meaning-making, emotional regulation, and optimism based on realistic assessment rather than wishful thinking. But the Stoics understood resilience not just as a survival mechanism, but as a path to human flourishing. They didn't just want to endure hardship, they wanted to be transformed by it. Marcus Aurelius, writing while managing plague, war, and political upheaval, captured this beautifully. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This isn't motivational rhetoric. This is practical philosophy. Every obstacle contains within it the exact training you need to develop the qualities required to transcend it. Financial difficulty teaches resourcefulness and clarity about what truly matters. Relationship conflict develops patience and communication skills. Professional setbacks build resilience and force innovation. But this transformation only occurs if you approach obstacles as training rather than as problems to be escaped. Watch someone learning a musical instrument. The difficulty isn't a bug in the system, it's the entire point. The resistance creates the capacity. The struggle develops the skill. Without challenge, there would be no growth. Now imagine approaching your entire life with this mentality, not seeking to eliminate all difficulty, but learning to engage with whatever arises as precisely the curriculum you need for developing your highest capacities. This requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to discomfort. Instead of viewing pain as evidence that something has gone wrong, you begin to see it as information about where growth is needed. Instead of avoiding challenge, you start to recognize it as the raw material for building strength. Consider temperance, the virtue of moderation and self-regulation. In a culture that encourages immediate gratification and excess consumption, temperance isn't just a nice idea, it's a survival skill. Every day, you're bombarded with opportunities to choose momentary pleasure over long-term well-being. The extra hour of television instead of exercise, the second helping of food you don't really need. The purchase that provides temporary satisfaction but contributes to financial stress. The angry response that feels justified but damages relationships. Temperance isn't about becoming rigid or joyless. It's about developing the capacity to choose based on your deeper values rather than your immediate impulses. It's about creating space between desire and action, between feeling and response. Justice, in the Stoic sense, extends beyond legal fairness to encompass your role in the larger community of human beings. It asks, how can your choices contribute to the flourishing of others? How can your response to challenge inspire rather than discourage those around you? How can your growth serve something larger than your personal comfort? This perspective transforms suffering from a purely personal experience into an opportunity for service. When you handle difficulty with grace, you provide an example for others facing similar challenges. When you respond to unfairness without becoming bitter, you help preserve everyone's faith in human goodness. And wisdom, the virtue that integrates all the others, emerges through the practical application of philosophical insights to real circumstances. Wisdom isn't accumulated knowledge. It's the capacity to discern what matters most in each situation and to act accordingly. The training montage of the mind begins when you start treating daily challenges as opportunities to practice these virtues rather than as interruptions to your preferred life. The difficult boss becomes a chance to practice patience and clear communication. The financial setback becomes an opportunity to develop resourcefulness and clarity about priorities. The health challenge becomes training in acceptance and appreciation for what remains possible. This isn't about pretending to be grateful for genuinely harmful situations. It's about finding the growth opportunity that exists within whatever you cannot change. But this training requires what athletes call progressive overload, gradually increasing the challenge to continue building capacity. You can't develop psychological strength by avoiding all psychological stress any more than you can develop physical strength by avoiding all physical resistance. The Stoics practiced this through what they called spiritual exercises, not religious practices, but mental training designed to strengthen their capacity to respond wisely under pressure. They would imagine losing everything they valued to practice acceptance. They would voluntarily experience discomfort to build tolerance for involuntary discomfort. They would examine their automatic responses to identify patterns that needed conscious correction. This kind of training feels counterintuitive in a culture that promises happiness through the elimination of all discomfort. But consider the alternative: a life spent trying to control uncontrollable circumstances, avoiding unavoidable challenges, and remaining vulnerable to any disruption of your preferred conditions. The philosophy of endurance doesn't promise an easy life. It promises something far more valuable: the capacity to meet whatever life presents with dignity, wisdom, and strength. When you understand that your character is built through challenge rather than in spite of it, everything changes. Obstacles become curriculum. Difficulties become opportunities. Resistance becomes the very force that creates resilience. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "How can I grow through this?" You stop trying to avoid all discomfort and start developing the capacity to remain centered within it. This is the beginning of real freedom. Not the freedom from challenge, but the freedom to choose how you'll meet whatever arises. The fire of discipline burns away what is weak and leaves what is strong. The question isn't whether you'll face difficulties. You will. The question is whether you'll use them to become who you're capable of being. Deep within the architecture of your mind, a war is raging. It's been going on since the moment you developed the capacity for choice, and it will continue until your last conscious breath. This isn't the dramatic conflict of good versus evil that fills movies and novels. This is the subtler, more consequential battle between your immediate impulses and your considered values, between reaction and response, between the part of you that seeks comfort and the part of you that seeks growth. Neuroscience has given us a map of this battlefield. The limbic system, ancient, fast, emotional, scanning constantly for threats and opportunities, ready to flood your consciousness with fight-or-flight chemistry at the first sign of danger. The prefrontal cortex, newer, slower, rational, capable of complex planning, moral reasoning, and long-term thinking, but easily overwhelmed when emotions run high. Every day, dozens of times, these systems compete for control of your behavior. The limbic system wants to check your phone compulsively, eat the extra cookie, avoid the difficult conversation, lash out when criticized, withdraw when challenged. The prefrontal cortex knows these impulses don't serve your deeper goals, but it often loses the battle to immediate emotional intensity. The Stoics understood this internal conflict long before brain scanners revealed its neurological basis. They called it the struggle between passion and reason, between what feels urgent and what actually matters, between living reactively and living deliberately. Epictetus taught that freedom isn't found in getting what you want, but in mastering the wanting itself. No one can hurt you without your permission, he said, not because harmful things won't happen, but because your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on external circumstances remaining favorable. But this mastery requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that your emotions, however intense they feel, are not direct responses to external events. They're responses to your interpretation of external events. And interpretations can be examined, questioned, and gradually changed. Consider anger, that surge of righteous energy that feels so justified when someone violates your expectations. Anger tells a compelling story. This shouldn't be happening. This person is wrong. I have every right to be upset. But underneath anger, almost always, is a more vulnerable emotion. Hurt, fear, disappointment, or the pain of unmet attachment. Someone didn't treat you the way you wanted to be treated. Something didn't go according to your plan. Your sense of control or importance was challenged. The anger feels more powerful than the underlying vulnerability, so you cling to it. It provides energy and a sense of righteous purpose. It makes you feel like you're doing something about the situation, even when that something is often counterproductive. But anger is also exhausting. It clouds judgment, damages relationships, and rarely leads to the outcomes you actually want. The energy that could be directed towards solving problems gets burned up in emotional reactivity. The Stoic approach isn't to suppress anger or pretend it doesn't exist. It's to recognize anger as information about your attachments and expectations, then choose how to respond based on your values rather than your emotional intensity. This requires what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to step back from automatic thoughts and examine them objectively. When someone criticizes your work, your immediate thought might be, "They don't understand what I'm trying to do. They're being unfair. I need to defend myself." But pause. Is the criticism accurate? Is there something useful in it, even if it's delivered poorly? What response would serve your goals rather than just your ego? How would you want to be treated if you were offering feedback to someone else? This pause, this space between stimulus and response, is where freedom lives. It's the narrow opening through which you can escape the prison of automatic reactivity. Fear operates similarly. It tells urgent stories about imaginary future dangers, flooding your system with stress hormones that were designed for immediate physical threats, but are now triggered by emails, social situations, and abstract possibilities. Fear says, what if you fail? What if people judge you? What if you're not prepared? What if you're not good enough? And because these scenarios feel real when you're experiencing fear, you often respond as if they're actually happening, rather than recognizing them as mental events that may or may not have any basis in reality. Envy whispers seductive comparisons. Look what they have that you don't. Look how easy their life appears. You're falling behind. You're missing out. You deserve what they have. But envy is based on the illusion that you can accurately assess other people's inner experience based on their external circumstances. You're comparing your behind-the-scenes reality with their highlight reel, your complete picture with their curated presentation. Jean-Paul Sartre observed that we are condemned to be free, that every moment presents choices that we cannot escape making. Even choosing not to choose is a choice. Even following our emotions uncritically is a choice to let emotions choose for us. This freedom is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means you cannot blame your responses entirely on external circumstances. Liberating because it means you have more power over your experience than you typically realize. The battle within intensifies as you begin to consciously choose responses that align with your values rather than your immediate impulses. The old patterns resist. The emotional systems that have been running your life don't give up control easily. This is where most people abandon the effort. The gap between knowing what would be wise and actually doing what would be wise can feel overwhelming. It's easier to return to familiar patterns of reactivity than to persist through the discomfort of change. But this is precisely where the work matters most. Each time you choose response over reaction, you strengthen the neural pathways that support conscious choice. Each time you act on your values rather than your emotions, you build the capacity to do so again. The Stoics called this ascesis, spiritual exercise, training in virtue through repeated practice. Like physical training, it's often uncomfortable. Like physical training, the discomfort is evidence that you're building strength. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do?" Ting. This isn't about becoming emotionless or perfectly rational. Emotions provide valuable information about what matters to you, but they're not reliable guides for action. They're data to be considered along with other factors like your long-term goals, your relationships, and your character. The victory in this internal battle isn't the elimination of difficult emotions or challenging impulses. The victory is the gradual development of the capacity to choose your response based on wisdom rather than being driven by whatever feeling happens to be strongest in the moment. In this choice, repeated thousands of times across a lifetime, you discover who you actually are beneath all the reactions, preferences, and automatic patterns. You discover that you are free. At 4:30 a.m., while the world sleeps in the comfort of unconsciousness, she sits in silence. No phone, no distractions, no escape from the subtle discomfort of her own thoughts. For 30 minutes each morning, she practices something that seems almost perverse in our comfort-obsessed culture. She voluntarily chooses difficulty. This is not masochism. This is not self-punishment. This is the ancient art of inoculation, deliberately exposing yourself to manageable doses of discomfort to build immunity to its more virulent forms. The Stoics understood something that modern psychology has rediscovered through research on stress inoculation and exposure therapy. The only way to become comfortable with discomfort is through controlled exposure to it. You cannot build resilience by avoiding all resistance any more than you can build physical strength by avoiding all physical challenge. Seneca, one of Rome's wealthiest citizens, regularly spent days eating only bread and water, sleeping on the ground, wearing rough clothing, not out of poverty, but out of wisdom. Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" He was practicing what psychologists now call stress inoculation training, graduated exposure to manageable levels of stress to build confidence in your ability to handle greater challenges when they arise involuntarily. But voluntary discomfort serves multiple purposes beyond building resilience. It reveals the difference between what you think you need and what you actually need. It exposes the degree to which your peace of mind depends on external conditions remaining exactly as you prefer them. It shows you that most of what you consider necessities are actually luxuries you've become accustomed to. Consider the simple practice of fasting, not eating for a specified period. Within hours, your mind begins to reveal its relationship with comfort and control. You notice how often you eat, not from hunger, but from boredom, anxiety, or habit. You discover that the discomfort of an empty stomach is far less severe than your anticipatory anxiety about experiencing that discomfort. You realize that your body is designed to function without constant fuel, that there's something clarifying about the slight edge of hunger, that many of your thoughts about needing to eat immediately are just thoughts, not emergencies. Or try the practice of deliberate silence, choosing not to speak unless necessary for an entire day. Watch how often you want to fill empty spaces with words, how uncomfortable you become with allowing others to have the last word, how much of your speaking serves your ego rather than genuine communication. In silence, you encounter the part of yourself that exists before words, that doesn't need to prove its existence through constant commentary. You discover that most conversations continue quite well without your contributions, that listening deeply is often more valuable than speaking cleverly. The practice of voluntary discomfort extends beyond these formal exercises into the texture of daily life. Taking cold showers when you could choose warm ones, walking when you could drive, sitting with anxiety instead of immediately reaching for distraction, feeling sadness without rushing to escape it through entertainment or substances. Each small choice to embrace rather than avoid discomfort builds your confidence that you can handle whatever involuntary discomfort life presents. When you've already proven to yourself that you can function without constant comfort, unexpected challenges feel less threatening. Marcus Aurelius captured this beautifully. Ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? Most of what we say and do is not essential. If you can eliminate it, you'll have more time and more tranquility. Ask yourself, is this something that's, or is not, up to me? This isn't about becoming a minimalist or rejecting all pleasure. It's about distinguishing between what enhances your life and what you've become dependent on for your sense of well-being. It's about finding the difference between genuine enjoyment and desperate grasping. When you can enjoy pleasures without needing them, they become more enjoyable. When you can be comfortable without specific conditions, comfort becomes more meaningful. When you can be happy without having to have things go your way, happiness becomes more stable. Modern exposure therapy validates this ancient wisdom. Therapists help people overcome phobias by gradually exposing them to what they fear in controlled, manageable doses. Someone afraid of flying might start by looking at pictures of airplanes, then visiting an airport, then sitting in a stationary plane, gradually building tolerance for higher levels of anxiety. The principle is identical. Controlled exposure to discomfort builds capacity to handle involuntary discomfort. But the Stoics applied this not just to specific phobias, but to the fundamental human tendency to avoid all forms of difficulty. They practiced premeditatio malorum, imagining loss, failure, rejection, illness, death. Not to become pessimistic, but to reduce their shock value and discover that you can psychologically survive even worst-case scenarios. If you lost your job tomorrow, you would figure out how to proceed. If someone you love became ill, you would find ways to help and cope. If your plans completely fell through, you would make new plans. You've handled 100% of your worst days so far. Evidence suggests you could handle whatever comes next. But this confidence only develops if you practice experiencing discomfort voluntarily rather than waiting for life to impose it involuntarily. When challenges arise, and they will, you meet them with the calm knowledge that you've already proven your capacity to function without ideal conditions. The art of voluntary discomfort also reveals how much of your suffering comes not from actual circumstances, but from your resistance to circumstances. When you choose discomfort, resistance disappears. The cold shower you chose feels different from the cold shower imposed by a broken water heater. The hunger you elected feels different from the hunger forced by circumstances. This distinction illuminates something profound. Suffering equals pain times resistance. Pain is often unavoidable, but resistance is optional. When you stop fighting what is and start working with what is, even difficult situations become more manageable. Voluntary discomfort trains you to drop resistance even when you didn't choose the circumstances. You learn to respond to involuntary challenges with the same acceptance you bring to chosen difficulties. The ultimate goal isn't to seek out suffering or to reject all comfort. The goal is to become equally capable of thriving in comfort or discomfort, success or failure, praise or criticism. To build a sense of well-being that doesn't require external conditions to remain exactly as you prefer them. In a world that promises happiness through the elimination of all discomfort, this practice seems radical. But it leads to a deeper form of happiness, one based not on getting what you want, but on developing the capacity to meet whatever arises with strength, wisdom, and grace. When you can be at peace without needing peace, you discover peace that no external circumstance can disturb. The philosophy proves itself not in quiet contemplation, but in the crucible of real life. When the diagnosis arrives unexpectedly, when the relationship ends without warning, when the job disappears through circumstances beyond your control, when the careful plans collapse and the future you imagined evaporates in a single phone call. This is where Stoicism reveals its true nature, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a practical framework for remaining human when everything feels inhuman. Consider Sarah, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children after her ex-husband stopped paying support. The car breaks down on the same day her younger son develops a fever that requires missing work. The landlord calls about late rent while she's sitting in the emergency room, watching her savings disappear into medical bills she can't afford. The temptation toward despair is overwhelming. The urge to rage against unfairness, to collapse into victimhood, to blame circumstances for her misery feels entirely justified. Most people would understand and sympathize with any of these responses. But Sarah has been practicing something different. She's learned to ask not, "Why is this happening to me?" but "How can I respond to what's happening in a way that serves my values?" She cannot control her ex-husband's behavior, her car's mechanical problems, or her son's illness. But she can control how she chooses to meet these challenges. She can remain present with her son instead of being consumed by anxiety about money. She can seek practical solutions instead of being paralyzed by the magnitude of the problems. She can maintain her dignity instead of being diminished by circumstances. This isn't positive thinking or denial of difficulty. This is the practical application of philosophical wisdom to real crisis. She acknowledges the pain without being controlled by it. She faces the problems without being overwhelmed by them. She maintains agency within circumstances that feel completely beyond her control. Or consider Marcus, a firefighter responding to a structure fire with people trapped inside. The building is unstable, the smoke is thick, the heat is intense. Everything in his mammalian brain is screaming for him to retreat to safety, but he's trained for exactly this moment, not just physically, but mentally. He's practiced the Stoic discipline of focusing entirely on what's within his control, his training, his equipment, his decision-making process, his courage to act in service of others despite personal risk. He cannot control whether the building will collapse or whether everyone can be saved, but he can control the quality of his response to the emergency. The Stoic mindset doesn't eliminate fear, it transforms the relationship with fear. Fear becomes information rather than paralysis, data about risk rather than a command to retreat. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's right action in the presence of fear. In the boardroom, David watches his presentation met with skepticism and criticism from executives who seem to have already made their decision. His first impulse is defensive, to argue, to justify, to prove that his critics don't understand. But he's been practicing a different response. He listens carefully to the criticism, looking for whatever truth it might contain. He responds to questions honestly rather than trying to manipulate outcomes. He maintains his professional composure while internally letting go of attachment to specific results. He's learned that his sense of worth cannot depend on others' approval or specific professional outcomes. He can prepare thoroughly, present clearly, and respond thoughtfully. But he cannot control how his ideas will be received or what decisions others will make. This perspective allows him to engage fully without being crushed by rejection or inflated by acceptance. Success becomes learning and growth rather than external validation. Failure becomes information and redirection rather than personal catastrophe. The Stoic mindset reveals itself most clearly in how people handle loss. When relationships end, when loved ones die, when cherished dreams prove impossible, when the life you planned gives way to the life you actually have. Elizabeth sits beside her husband's hospital bed, watching cancer gradually claim the person she's loved for 30 years. The medical interventions aren't working. The hope for recovery is fading. The future they imagined together is becoming impossible. She could spend these precious days raging against the unfairness, bargaining with God, or collapsing into anticipatory grief. Instead, she chooses presence. She focuses on what remains possible: meaningful conversation, physical comfort, expression of love, making peace with whatever needs resolution. She cannot control the disease or its progression, but she can control how she chooses to be present with her husband during his final weeks. She can offer love instead of desperation, peace instead of panic, acceptance instead of futile resistance to what cannot be changed. This isn't resignation or emotional numbness. This is the deepest form of love, choosing to be fully present with reality as it is rather than being consumed by wishes for reality to be different. The Stoic mindset in action looks like calm competence during crisis, like grace under pressure, like maintaining humanity when everything feels inhuman. But it's not about appearing strong or impressing others with your philosophical sophistication. It's about discovering that your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on external circumstances remaining favorable. It's about learning that you can meet whatever arises with dignity and wisdom. It's about realizing that your capacity to choose your response is always available, regardless of what you're responding to. This mindset doesn't prevent pain. It prevents unnecessary suffering. It doesn't eliminate challenges. It transforms your relationship with challenge. It doesn't guarantee favorable outcomes. It guarantees that you'll respond to any outcome in a way that honors your deepest values. When you've truly internalized this approach, life becomes less anxious and more interesting. You stop needing to control uncontrollable outcomes and start focusing on controllable responses. You stop taking external circumstances personally and start taking your own character seriously. Problems become opportunities to practice wisdom. Setbacks become chances to develop resilience. Criticism becomes feedback for growth. Loss becomes an invitation to appreciate what remains. You realize that you've been looking for security in all the wrong places, in other people's behavior, in favorable circumstances, in outcomes beyond your influence. Real security comes from knowing that whatever happens, you have the capacity to respond wisely. This is how Stoicism moves from philosophy to lifestyle, from intellectual understanding to practical mastery. Not by eliminating life's difficulties, but by transforming your relationship with difficulty itself. When you can remain calm while the world burns around you, you become a source of stability for others caught in the chaos. When you can maintain perspective during crisis, you help others find their own center. When you can respond to challenge with wisdom rather than reactivity, you demonstrate that there's another way to be human. This is the Stoic mindset in action, not perfect, not effortless, but available in every moment as a choice you can make, regardless of what that moment contains. There comes a moment in every genuine transformation when all the philosophy, all the practice, all the careful understanding must yield to something deeper than knowledge. A moment when the mind's elaborate constructions fall away and you're left with the raw truth of what is, without commentary, without resistance, without the protective buffer of interpretation. This is the moment of surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of the ego's exhausting project of trying to control an uncontrollable universe. It might arrive during a sleepless night when worry has worn you so thin that you finally stop fighting your thoughts and simply observe them without believing them. Or in a hospital waiting room when all your plans for the future dissolve, and only this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this irreducible fact of being alive right now remains. For Anna, it happened while standing in her empty house 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. The life she'd built over 15 years, the shared routines, the joint decisions, the future she'd assumed was guaranteed, had evaporated. She'd tried to fight it, tried to save the marriage, tried to control outcomes that were never entirely hers to control. But in that moment, surrounded by boxes of a life being dismantled, something in her stopped fighting. Not gave up, stopped fighting. There was a difference, subtle but profound. The resistance that had been consuming her energy for months simply relaxed. Not because she no longer cared, but because she finally understood that her caring couldn't change what had already happened. Her pain was real, her loss was significant, her grief was necessary, but her resistance to the reality of loss was optional. In that surrender, something unexpected emerged. Space. Space to breathe, space to think clearly, space to begin imagining who she might become within these new circumstances rather than remaining trapped in who she used to be within the old ones. The Stoics called this amor fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance of whatever happens, but active embrace of whatever happens as the raw material for becoming who you're meant to be. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The art of living is more like wrestling than dancing, insofar as it stands ready against the accidental and the unforeseen, and is not apt to fall." This isn't about pretending to be grateful for genuinely harmful experiences. It's about finding the growth that becomes possible even within, especially within, experiences you wouldn't have chosen. The moment of surrender reveals something that all the philosophical understanding in the world cannot teach, that your resistance to reality is often more painful than reality itself, that the stories you tell yourself about what should have happened create more suffering than simply dealing with what actually happened. For Michael, a middle-aged accountant who'd spent 20 years climbing what he thought was the right ladder only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall, surrender looked like finally admitting that the career he'd built was slowly killing his soul. He'd kept trying to make it work, kept adjusting his expectations, kept hoping the next promotion would finally deliver the satisfaction he'd been seeking. But one Tuesday morning, sitting in a meeting about quarterly projections that felt completely disconnected from anything meaningful, he stopped pretending, stopped trying to be enthusiastic about work that felt empty, stopped fighting the truth that his life needed to change in ways that terrified him. The surrender wasn't dramatic. There was no storming out of the office or burning bridges. There was just the quiet recognition that he'd been trying to force a life that didn't fit, and that all his efforts to make it fit were preventing him from discovering what might actually work. Existentialist philosophers understood this moment as the confrontation with authentic existence, the recognition that you've been living according to others' expectations rather than your own deepest sense of purpose. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about the anxiety that emerges when you realize you're condemned to be free, that you cannot escape the responsibility of choosing who you become. But this anxiety, overwhelming as it feels, points toward liberation. When you stop trying to be who you think you should be and start exploring who you actually are, life becomes less constrained and more creative, less predictable and more alive. The moment of surrender often involves tears, not tears of self-pity, but tears of release. The kind of crying that comes when you finally stop holding up a weight you were never meant to carry. When you admit that you cannot fix other people, cannot control outcomes, cannot guarantee that life will go according to your plans. There's grief in this recognition, the grief of lost illusions, of abandoned certainties, of futures that will never exist. But there's also profound relief. When you stop trying to be God in your own life, you discover what it means to be human. When you stop demanding that life be different than it is, you can finally engage with life as it actually is. This engagement requires what the Stoics called preferred indifference. You can have preferences about how things go, health over sickness, prosperity over poverty, harmony over conflict, but your fundamental well-being cannot depend on getting what you prefer. Your peace cannot be hostage to circumstances beyond your control. Surrender doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means learning to hold your goals lightly while pursuing them wholeheartedly, to care deeply about outcomes while remaining unattached to specific results, to invest fully in relationships while accepting that you cannot control how others choose to respond. In the moment of surrender, you discover that acceptance is not resignation, but the beginning of wisdom. When you stop fighting reality, you can start working skillfully with reality. When you stop demanding that life be easy, you can start appreciating the strength that develops through meeting difficulty well. The obstacle truly becomes the path, not through magical thinking, but through the practical recognition that whatever you're facing contains exactly the curriculum you need for developing qualities you didn't know you had. Courage emerges when you face what you've been avoiding. Compassion develops when you stop judging others for their imperfections and start recognizing shared humanity. Wisdom grows when you learn from mistakes rather than being crushed by them. Patience develops when you accept that meaningful change takes time. In surrender, you finally understand what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Not because external circumstances don't matter, but because your capacity to respond wisely to any circumstance is always available. This capacity doesn't guarantee that life will be easy, but it guarantees that you can meet whatever difficulty arises without being diminished by it. The moment of surrender is when philosophy becomes lived wisdom, when understanding becomes transformation, when the mind's resistance finally yields to the heart's deeper knowing that you are far more resilient than you ever imagined. In this surrender, you don't lose yourself, you find yourself. There is a love beyond preference, beyond getting what you want, beyond having things go according to plan. It's the love that emerges when you finally understand that everything that has happened to you, the victories and defeats, the joy and sorrow, the moments of clarity and years of confusion, has been exactly what was needed to bring you to this moment of understanding. The Stoics called it amor fati, love of fate, not mere acceptance, not resigned tolerance, but genuine love for the totality of your experience, including the parts you would never have chosen. This seems impossible at first. How can you love the betrayal that shattered your trust? How can you embrace the loss that broke your heart? How can you be grateful for the failure that derailed your dreams? The answer lies in recognizing that you are not the same person who experienced those events. You have been shaped by them, strengthened by them, made wiser and more compassionate through them. The person you are now could not exist without everything that came before, the light and the shadow, the beautiful and the terrible. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his tent during military campaigns that he never wanted to undertake, discovered this truth. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate associates you. He wasn't speaking from a position of ease or comfort. He was finding love for life in the midst of circumstances that challenged everything he might have preferred. This perspective requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your relationship with time and experience. Instead of seeing your life as a series of events that either support or threaten your happiness, you begin to see it as a curriculum perfectly designed to develop the qualities you need to become fully human. The difficult boss taught you patience and clear communication. The financial struggle showed you what truly matters and what you can live without. The health crisis reminded you that time is precious and not to be wasted on petty concerns. The ended relationship revealed patterns that needed healing and opened space for more authentic connection. This isn't about pretending that harmful things are actually good, or that you should seek out suffering, or that everything happens for a predetermined reason. It's about recognizing that your capacity to grow through difficulty is so remarkable that no experience, however painful, need be ultimately destructive to your well-being. Modern psychology has validated this ancient wisdom through research on post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people don't just recover from difficult experiences, but actually become stronger, wiser, and more resilient as a result of working through them skillfully. People who've faced serious illness often report a clearer sense of priorities and deeper appreciation for simple pleasures. Those who've survived relationship trauma frequently develop greater emotional intelligence and capacity for authentic intimacy. Individuals who've experienced professional setbacks often discover more meaningful career paths they never would have considered otherwise. But this growth doesn't happen automatically. It requires what the Stoics practiced: the discipline of finding meaning and learning in every experience, especially the ones that initially seem meaningless or purely destructive. Friedrich Nietzsche, deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, captured this beautifully. "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it." This love isn't sentimental or emotional in the conventional sense. It's a recognition that resistance to what has already happened creates suffering without changing anything about the past. It's an understanding that your energy is better invested in working skillfully with present reality than in wishing that past reality had been different. When you truly embrace amor fati, something extraordinary happens to your relationship with future challenges. Since you've discovered that you can grow through any difficulty, you stop being afraid of difficulty. Since you've learned that setbacks can become setups for breakthroughs, you stop being paralyzed by the possibility of failure. This doesn't mean becoming reckless or indifferent to outcomes. You still plan carefully, work diligently, and hope for favorable results. But your fundamental peace no longer depends on getting what you want. Your sense of meaning no longer requires life to go according to your preferences. You begin to trust the process of existence itself, not because you believe everything will turn out well in some simplistic sense, but because you've proven to yourself that you can find wisdom and strength in whatever turns out to happen. This trust transforms everything. Relationships become easier because you stop trying to control how others behave and start focusing on how you can show up with integrity. Work becomes more fulfilling because success is redefined as growth and contribution rather than just external achievement. Daily life becomes more peaceful because you're no longer at war with reality. The practice of amor fati begins with small moments of acceptance. Instead of complaining about the traffic, you can be grateful for a few minutes of solitude. Instead of being irritated by a rude clerk, you can practice compassion for someone who's probably having a difficult day. Instead of resenting a criticism, you can look for whatever truth it might contain. These micro moments of embracing rather than resisting what is gradually build your capacity for loving larger and more challenging aspects of your fate. You develop what athletes call conditioning, the ability to remain calm and functional under increasing levels of stress. But the deepest practice of amor fati involves looking back at your entire life story and finding gratitude for the thread that connects everything, the invisible wisdom that guided you through experiences you didn't understand at the time toward understanding you couldn't have gained any other way. The childhood struggles that taught you resilience, the early failures that kept you humble, the broken relationships that showed you what genuine love requires, the losses that revealed what truly matters, the mistakes that forced you to develop wisdom. When you can see your life this way, not as a series of random events, some good and some bad, but as a perfectly orchestrated education in becoming fully human, something profound shifts in your relationship with whatever comes next. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What now?" You stop demanding that life be fair and start appreciating that life is interesting. You stop trying to control outcomes and start trusting your capacity to respond wisely to any outcome. This is the liberation that amor fati offers. Freedom from the exhausting project of trying to arrange the universe to match your preferences, and the discovery that you can be deeply happy with the universe exactly as it arranges itself. In this love of fate, you find not resignation, but enthusiasm, not passivity, but deep engagement, not indifference, but a more profound form of caring, one that doesn't depend on getting what you want, but on bringing wisdom and compassion to whatever you get. You realize that you have never been fighting life. You have been fighting your thoughts about life. And in the moment you stop fighting, you discover that life itself has always been on your side. The transformation doesn't happen in moments of crisis or dramatic revelation. It happens in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices, in the quiet rhythm of daily practices, in the barely noticeable shifts in how you respond to ordinary moments. You wake each morning to the same fundamental choice. Will you live this day reactively or deliberately? Will you be carried along by the momentum of habits and impulses, or will you remember that each moment offers an opportunity to express your deepest values? This choice matters more than any single dramatic decision you'll ever make, because this choice repeats itself every morning for the rest of your life. The Stoics understood that virtue isn't an achievement, but a practice, not a destination, but a way of traveling, not something you attain once, but something you choose continuously, in moments so small they seem insignificant until you realize they're the building blocks of an entire existence. Marcus Aurelius began each day with reflection, reminding himself of the principles that would guide his choices. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so, none of them can hurt me. This wasn't pessimism about human nature. This was realistic preparation for the challenges of interacting with other imperfect human beings, while remaining committed to responding with wisdom rather than reactivity. Your morning sets the tone for everything that follows. The first hour after waking can determine whether you'll spend the day feeling purposeful and calm or scattered and reactive. This isn't about elaborate rituals or time-consuming routines. It's about beginning each day with conscious intention rather than unconscious momentum. Before checking your phone, before consuming the urgent demands of others, you can take 5 minutes to remember who you want to be today. What qualities do you want to embody? How do you want to respond to challenges? What kind of presence do you want to bring to your interactions? This brief pause creates space between your essential self and the roles you'll play throughout the day. It reminds you that you are not just your job title, your relationship status, your financial situation, or your current problems. You are the awareness that can choose how to engage with all of these identities and circumstances. The virtue of the everyday reveals itself in how you handle interruptions to your plans, the unexpected phone call, the traffic delay, the colleague who needs help with something that's not your responsibility. These moments test whether your peace depends on everything going smoothly or whether you've developed the capacity to remain centered within whatever arises. It appears in how you respond to minor irritations, the slow internet connection, the long line at the store, the loud conversation at the next table. Do these small frustrations knock you off balance, or have you built enough inner stability to remain calm within minor turbulence? It shows up in how you treat people who can't do anything for you. The server who's having a bad day, the customer service representative dealing with your problem, the person asking for directions on the street. Your character is revealed not in how you behave when you're trying to impress someone, but in how you behave when you think no one important is watching. Seneca practiced evening review, looking back at the day's experiences with the curiosity of a scientist studying interesting data. When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, I examine the whole day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This isn't self-criticism or dwelling on mistakes. It's conscious learning from experience. What situations triggered reactive responses? Where did you respond with wisdom rather than impulse? What patterns do you notice? What would you do differently if faced with similar circumstances tomorrow? The evening review serves multiple purposes. It helps you learn from experience rather than just accumulating experience. It builds self-awareness by highlighting unconscious patterns. It reinforces good choices by acknowledging them consciously, and it ends each day with the satisfying sense that you've lived deliberately rather than just survived unconsciously. But the deepest virtue of the everyday is found in presence itself. The practice of being fully here for whatever is happening right now rather than being mentally elsewhere. This might seem simple, but it's revolutionary in a culture that rewards constant distraction and multitasking. When you're eating, just eat. Taste the food, notice the texture, appreciate the nourishment. When you're walking, feel your feet touching the ground, observe your surroundings, breathe the air. When you're listening to someone, really listen, not while planning your response or thinking about other things, but with full attention to understanding their perspective. This quality of presence transforms ordinary experiences into moments of richness and depth. A simple conversation becomes an opportunity for genuine connection. A routine task becomes a chance to practice mindfulness. A challenging situation becomes training in patience and wisdom. Your life is not what happens to you, it's how consciously you meet what happens to you. And this consciousness is developed not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated practice of choosing awareness over autopilot in thousands of small moments. The kitchen becomes a place to practice patience while cooking. The commute becomes time for reflection or gratitude rather than stress and frustration. The workplace becomes a laboratory for practicing virtue under pressure. The evening becomes an opportunity for connection with loved ones rather than mindless entertainment. Each day offers countless opportunities to practice the principles you've learned, distinguishing between what you can and cannot control, responding thoughtfully rather than reactively, maintaining inner calm regardless of external circumstances, treating others with compassion even when they're difficult. These practices don't require special conditions or additional time. They require only the remembering, in each moment, that you have a choice about how to be present with whatever that moment contains. The Stoics discovered that this everyday virtue is actually the highest form of spiritual practice. Not dramatic acts of heroism or perfect adherence to complex philosophical systems, but the simple commitment to bringing consciousness and compassion to ordinary human experience. In this commitment, repeated daily across years and decades, you discover that transformation happens not through trying to become someone completely different, but through becoming more fully yourself. The self that exists beneath the reactive patterns, the self that can choose wisdom over impulse, the self that remains calm and kind regardless of circumstances. This is how philosophy becomes a way of life. One morning, one moment, one choice at a time. The greatest misconception about Stoicism is that it leads to isolation, that becoming centered and self-possessed means withdrawing from the messy complications of human community. But the opposite is true. When you stop being controlled by external circumstances, you become more available for genuine service. When you stop taking things personally, you can respond to others' needs with clarity rather than reactivity. The Stoic who has found inner stability doesn't retreat from the world. They engage with it more skillfully. Marcus Aurelius didn't practice philosophy in a monastery or ivory tower. He developed Stoic wisdom while leading an empire, managing political crises, and making decisions that affected millions of lives. His private meditations weren't an escape from responsibility, but preparation for meeting responsibility with wisdom. "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee," he wrote, recognizing that individual flourishing and collective well-being are interconnected rather than competing concerns. This insight challenges the modern assumption that personal growth and social engagement exist in tension with each other, that you must choose between working on yourself and working for others. That inner peace requires disengagement from outer challenges. But consider how much more effectively you can help others when you're not constantly struggling with your own emotional reactivity. How much clearer your judgment becomes when you're not clouded by personal agenda. How much more present you can be with someone else's pain when you're not overwhelmed by your own anxiety. The person who has learned to remain calm during conflict can actually listen to opposing viewpoints rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. They can seek understanding rather than victory, solutions rather than blame. They can respond to anger with patience, to fear with reassurance, to confusion with clarity. This doesn't mean becoming passive or abandoning your convictions. It means expressing your convictions from a place of inner strength rather than defensive insecurity. Speaking truth without needing to prove you're right. Standing for your values without needing others to validate them. In leadership, Stoic principles translate into what modern management theory calls servant leadership. Authority exercised not for personal gain, but for the benefit of those being served. The leader who has conquered their own ego can focus entirely on what's best for the organization rather than what makes them look good. They can make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by the need for popularity. They can give honest feedback without being cruel, They can accept criticism without being defensive. They can share credit generously and take responsibility for failures completely. Consider Sarah Chen, a hospital administrator who discovered Stoic philosophy during the early months of the pandemic. Facing impossible decisions about resource allocation, staff safety, and patient care, she found herself practicing Marcus Aurelius's approach to leadership under extreme pressure. She couldn't control the virus, the supply chain disruptions, or the political responses that complicated her work. But she could control her own response to these challenges. She could remain calm in meetings where others were panicking. She could make decisions based on available data rather than wishful thinking. She could communicate clearly even when the situation was unclear. Her staff began to notice something different about her presence during crisis. She wasn't adding to the chaos with her own anxiety. She wasn't making decisions based on what would be politically popular. She was consistently asking, what would be best for patient care? And how can we support our staff through this? This approach didn't eliminate the stress of her position, but it transformed her relationship with the stress. Instead of being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control, she focused intensely on the aspects of the situation where her choices could make a difference. In relationships, Stoic wisdom manifests as the capacity to love without possessiveness, to give without keeping score, to remain committed to others' well-being even when they're not behaving in ways you prefer. This isn't about becoming a doormat or abandoning healthy boundaries. It's about responding to relationship challenges from a place of strength rather than neediness. When your partner is going through a difficult time, you can offer support without trying to fix their emotions or take responsibility for their mood. When friends make choices you disagree with, you can maintain the relationship without trying to control their decisions. When family members behave badly, you can protect yourself without cutting them off entirely or harboring resentment. The Stoic approach to social justice recognizes that changing external systems requires first changing yourself, not because external problems aren't real, but because you can't give what you don't have. You can't offer genuine compassion if you're consumed by your own anger. You can't build unity if you're driven by the need to be right. You can't create peace if you're at war with yourself. This doesn't mean avoiding action on important issues. It means taking action from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. Choosing strategies based on effectiveness rather than emotional satisfaction. Sustaining commitment to long-term change rather than burning out in short-term outrage. Martin Luther King Jr., deeply influenced by Stoic thought, demonstrated this approach throughout the civil rights movement. Facing extreme hostility and injustice, he maintained inner peace while working tirelessly for external change. He responded to violence with non-violence, to hatred with love, to despair with hope, not because he was naturally passive, but because he understood that responding to injustice with more injustice perpetuates rather than solves problems. In community involvement, Stoicism looks like showing up consistently rather than dramatically. Volunteering regularly at local organizations rather than just during highly publicized events. Listening carefully to understand community needs rather than imposing your own ideas about what help should look like. It means being useful rather than just well-intentioned. Developing practical skills that can benefit others. Contributing your time and energy based on where you can be most effective rather than where you'll receive the most recognition. The Stoic in society understands that their primary responsibility is to be a source of stability and wisdom, rather than adding to the chaos and reactivity that already exists in abundance. They become the person others can count on during crisis, who offers calm perspective during conflict, who chooses constructive action over destructive criticism. This influence spreads through example rather than argument. When others observe someone remaining centered during difficulty, maintaining integrity under pressure, and responding to challenges with wisdom rather than reactivity, it reminds them that these responses are possible. You don't need to teach Stoicism explicitly to share its benefits with others. You share it by embodying it, by demonstrating that it's possible to be fully engaged with life's challenges without being overwhelmed by them, to care deeply about outcomes without being controlled by them, to work for change without being destroyed by resistance. In this way, personal transformation becomes social transformation. Not through forcing others to change, but through changing yourself in ways that make positive change more possible for everyone around you. The stillness you find within chaos becomes a gift you offer to a world that desperately needs more sources of calm wisdom and fewer sources of reactive drama. You return to where you started, but everything has changed. Not the external circumstances of your life. Those may be exactly the same as when you began this journey. The same job, the same relationships, the same challenges and responsibilities. But the one who perceives these circumstances has been quietly, fundamentally transformed. It's like returning to a childhood home as an adult. The rooms are the same size they always were, but they seem smaller now because you've grown. The problems that once seemed overwhelming now appear manageable because you've developed new capacities for handling them. The people who used to trigger your reactivity still behave the same way, but their behavior no longer has the power to disturb your inner equilibrium. This is the circular nature of wisdom, not progress towards some distant goal, but a deepening understanding of what was always present. You haven't acquired something new so much as you've remembered something essential that was temporarily forgotten. The anxiety about the future that used to consume your present moments hasn't disappeared because life has become more predictable. It's diminished because you've proven to yourself that you can handle uncertainty. The need for others' approval that used to drive your decisions hasn't vanished because you've become more impressive. It's lessened because you've discovered a source of validation that doesn't depend on external recognition. The frustration with imperfect circumstances that used to steal your peace hasn't evaporated because everything now goes according to plan. It's transformed because you've learned to find peace within imperfection rather than demanding perfection as the price of peace. But the most profound change is one that only you can perceive. The space that now exists between events and your responses to events. That pause, barely noticeable to others, but revolutionary for you, where choice becomes possible, where wisdom can emerge instead of automatic reaction, where you remember that you are not your circumstances, your emotions, or your thoughts. You are the awareness within which all of these arise. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that existence precedes essence, that you exist first and then create who you become through your choices. But the Stoics understood something deeper, that beneath all the identities you create and shed across a lifetime, there exists an essential capacity for choice that remains constant. This capacity doesn't change with age, success, failure, or circumstances. It's available in every moment, regardless of what that moment contains. Recognizing this unchanging center within changing circumstances is what the Stoics called living according to nature. Not human nature as it typically expresses itself through reactivity and unconsciousness, but human nature as it exists when aligned with wisdom and virtue. You haven't become perfect. You still make mistakes, experience difficult emotions, and sometimes respond less skillfully than you'd prefer. But your relationship with these human imperfections has fundamentally shifted. Mistakes become information rather than identity. Difficult emotions become weather patterns moving through consciousness rather than definitions of who you are. Unskillful responses become opportunities for learning rather than evidence of fundamental failure. This shift doesn't make you invulnerable to life's challenges, it makes you more resilient in meeting them. You still feel sadness when you lose something important, but the sadness doesn't convince you that life is meaningless. You still experience fear when facing uncertainty, but the fear doesn't paralyze you or drive you to avoid all risk. You still feel anger when treated unfairly, but the anger doesn't consume you or drive you to respond destructively. The difference is that these emotions move through you rather than sticking to you. They inform you rather than controlling you. They add richness to your human experience rather than overwhelming it. People around you may not understand what's changed, but they feel it. There's something different about your presence, calmer, more solid, less reactive to drama and urgent demands for emotional response. You're still fully engaged with life, but you're engaging from a different place, a place of inner stability rather than constant vulnerability to external circumstances. Your relationships improve not because others have changed, but because you've stopped needing them to be different than they are in order for you to be okay. This doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior or abandoning healthy boundaries. It means responding to others' behavior from clarity rather than reactivity, from strength rather than neediness. Your work becomes more fulfilling not because the tasks have become more interesting, but because you've learned to find meaning in how you approach any task rather than demanding that tasks provide meaning. Excellence becomes possible when you stop being worried about recognition. Innovation emerges when you stop being afraid of failure. Even mundane activities, commuting, grocery shopping, doing dishes, take on a different quality when approached with presence rather than resistance. Not because these activities become inherently exciting, but because you stop requiring experiences to be exciting in order to be acceptable. The ancient Greek concept of nostos, the return home, captures something essential about this transformation. The hero's journey always involves leaving familiar territory, facing challenges in unknown lands, and eventually returning home with wisdom gained through trial. But the home you return to is both exactly the same and completely different, because you see it with transformed eyes. You have not changed the world, you have changed the one who sees the world. And in changing the seer, everything seen is transformed. The same sunrise you've watched 1,000 times suddenly appears as a daily miracle. The same people you've known for years reveal depths you never noticed when you were too caught up in your own reactivity to really see them. The same life you were living before, with its mixture of joy and sorrow, success and failure, clarity and confusion, becomes a gift rather than a burden. Not because its contents have improved, but because you've developed the capacity to receive whatever contents arise with wisdom and grace. This is the ultimate return to the self, the recognition that you were never broken and therefore never needed to be fixed. You needed to remember what you already knew, but had temporarily forgotten. You needed to develop capacities that were always latent within you, but required cultivation to emerge. The search for peace ends where it began, here, now, in this moment, with this breath, in this awareness that was present before the search started and will remain when the search ends. You are already whole. You always were. The journey was simply the process of remembering. Here, at the end of all philosophy, at the conclusion of every system and the final word of every teacher, is the simplest and most profound truth. This moment is all there is, not because past and future don't exist, but because your life only happens in the present. Every memory is experienced now, every plan is made now, every choice, every breath, every heartbeat occurs in the eternal now. The Stoics understood that presence is the highest form of freedom because it's the only place where choice actually exists. You cannot change the past. It has already been written. You cannot control the future. It remains unformed possibility. But you can choose how to be present with whatever this moment contains. This isn't about denying the practical importance of learning from history or planning for tomorrow. It's about recognizing that both memory and anticipation are present moment activities. When you remember, you're remembering now. When you plan, you're planning now. The only time anything actually happens is now. But most people spend most of their time mentally elsewhere, replaying conversations that ended years ago, rehearsing arguments that may never happen, worrying about outcomes they cannot control, missing the actual texture of their lives while lost in abstract thoughts about their lives. The discipline of presence begins with a simple recognition. Whatever you're thinking about right now is less real than the experience of thinking itself. The story in your mind is less immediate than the awareness within which the story appears. The emotion you're feeling is less fundamental than the consciousness that observes the emotion. This awareness, pure, immediate, undeniable, is always available. It doesn't come and go like thoughts and feelings. It doesn't succeed or fail like plans and projects. It doesn't age or decay like bodies and circumstances. It simply is, moment after moment, as constant as gravity and as intimate as breath. When you learn to rest in this awareness rather than being swept away by its contents, something remarkable happens. You discover that you already have everything you've been seeking, not in the sense of material possession or circumstance arrangement, but in the sense of fundamental completeness. Peace exists here, now, in the space between thoughts. Joy emerges naturally when you stop demanding that moments be different than they are. Love flows freely when you stop protecting yourself from the vulnerability of being alive. This isn't a philosophical theory or a mystical experience reserved for special people in special circumstances. This is the most practical discovery possible, that your essential well-being doesn't depend on anything external to this moment of awareness. The breath moving in and out of your body right now is sufficient. The light falling through whatever window is near you is enough. The sounds surrounding you, traffic, conversation, silence, are complete exactly as they are. You don't need to add anything to this moment to make it acceptable. You don't need to subtract anything to make it perfect. Marcus Aurelius, in his final meditations, returned again and again to this recognition: confine yourself to the present. Not because the present is always pleasant, but because it's always real. And reality, however challenging, is preferable to the fantasies and fears that occupy most mental activity. When difficult emotions arise, and they will, you can meet them in the present rather than being overwhelmed by stories about what they mean or where they might lead. Sadness, experienced directly without interpretation, is just sensation and energy moving through consciousness. Fear, met with presence rather than resistance, reveals itself as excitement in temporary disguise. Anger, faced honestly without justification or suppression, often transforms into the energy needed for appropriate action. When pleasant experiences occur, and they will, you can appreciate them fully without grasping desperately to make them permanent. Joy that doesn't need to last forever is more joyful. Love that doesn't demand guarantees is more loving. Success that doesn't require repetition is more satisfying. This is the wisdom that emerges from sustained presence, that trying to hold on to good moments destroys them, and trying to escape difficult moments prolongs them. But meeting each moment exactly as it is allows it to unfold naturally and transform according to its own rhythm. The practice is remarkably simple. When you notice your mind creating elaborate stories about past or future, gently return attention to present sensory experience. What do you see, hear, feel, taste, smell right now? When thoughts arise about what these sensations mean or what you should do about them, simply notice that thinking is happening and return to direct experience. This isn't about stopping thoughts, an impossible task that leads only to frustration. It's about changing your relationship with thinking. Instead of being lost in thought, you become aware of thought. Instead of being controlled by mental activity, you become the space within which mental activity occurs. In this space, you discover that you are far more vast than any particular thought, feeling, or circumstance. You are the awareness within which your entire life unfolds. This awareness has been present for every experience you've ever had, and will be present for every experience yet to come. Recognizing this awareness as your true nature doesn't solve all practical problems or eliminate all difficulties. You still need to pay bills, maintain relationships, take care of your health, and meet responsibilities. But you do all of this from a different place, a place of inner stability that doesn't depend on any particular outcome. From this place, life becomes workable regardless of its contents. Challenges become interesting rather than overwhelming. Uncertainty becomes adventure rather than anxiety. Other people's behavior becomes data rather than threats to your peace of mind. You realize that you've been looking for completion in the wrong places, not in achieving goals, accumulating possessions, winning approval, or controlling circumstances. Completion was always here, in the simple fact of being aware, being alive, being present to whatever is happening right now. This moment, exactly as it is, with whatever it contains, is sufficient. You are sufficient. The life you're living, however imperfect and uncertain, is enough. Not because you stop growing or caring about improvement, but because you stop making your fundamental okayness conditional on external factors. You can work for change from wholeness rather than brokenness, from love rather than fear, from presence rather than escape. The Stoic journey ends where it began, here, now, in this breath, in this awareness, in this eternal moment that contains all of time and eternity. You are already whole. You always were. Now live as if you remember. In this remembering, every moment becomes sacred, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Every breath becomes precious, not because it's guaranteed to continue, but because it's happening now. Every experience becomes meaningful, not because it matches your preferences, but because it's part of the extraordinary fact of being conscious in an unconscious universe. This is enough. You are enough. This moment is enough. Welcome home.